Deep in the woods, monsters and other things seem to lurk in the shadows. In the middle of nowhere, it seems like we are helpless in these isolated areas. These 10 people share their allegedly true, scary experiences out in the middle of nowhere. If you like this video, please give it a like, and subscribe to my channel and turn those notifications on. I upload videos like this multiple times a week. This happened to myself and a close friend. We're both 23-year-old males. This happened just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We are both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, and etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there was just us sitting around the fire. We saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30. This was fairly unusual. However, we did not think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night. We did not particularly want an unwelcomed guest. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading to our campsite, we moved off into the wood nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me, and he had a .22 rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was, he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out here. Why don't you come say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had, drying off near the fire, and threw them in the burn. My friend, who had trained the .22 at the man, asked me if he should shoot. I told him absolutely not, unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off from where he had come out a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in the backpack, and took off. It was now around 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police. It wasn't mysterious, however, it creeped the hell out of both of us. In 2007, I was working on a trail crew in the Trinity Alps of Northern California. We had 13 people on the crew and a few support staff. At this point, we'd been in the woods for about 2.5 months. We had all seen and heard bears, mountain lions, and pretty much anything that you can think of that would make terrifying noises. After dinner one evening, most of us were sitting around the fire, doing whatever, and all of a sudden, there's a huge, loud, agonizing scream sound. It was unlike anything any of us have ever heard. If I had to describe it, I'd call it a mountain lion shriek combined with the horror of a banshee. Everyone was understandably freaked the hell out. It sounded reasonably close, so a few of us, myself included, decided to investigate. About 3 miles from our base camp, there was a creature tied to a tree, absolutely losing its mind. It was a fucking llama. At this point, it's 10 p.m. or so and 25 plus miles from the nearest trailhead, and we find this llama tied to a tree just off the trail. We tried to calm it down without much success and went back to camp. The next morning, the llama was gone. It looked like it had broken its restraints and run off. We kept hearing the horrible llama noises from time to time over the few weeks. Towards the end of the season, a group of hunters passed us on the trail. After chatting for a bit, we found out they tied the llama there because it decided to be stubborn and refused to walk anymore. Apparently, it laid down the trail and would not move, so they left it and decided to come back for it. We figured at that point, the llama was probably dead. We hadn't heard any hellacious llama screams for a few months, and didn't really think about it. However, at the end of the season, when we finally got back to the crew van and we were driving out, that damn llama jumped across the road about 30 yards in front of us. I still think about the Demon Llama from time to time, and I hope he had a fulfilling life in the Trinities. In college, I spent 1 month house-sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. The nearest town was 22 miles away. It was June 1987. I know it was 87 because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeastern Idaho. I'm not going to say what town it was 22 miles from, because they might still own it, and I don't want this to get any more weirder than it already has. It was a pretty big place with a lot of acreage. The guy who was full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered me to pay $1,200 to go out there, free food, satellite TV, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never, ever been out west, so I took him up on it. It sounded better than doing landscape. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with dogs, riding the horses, and shooting. Completely uneventful experience, until that night. That night, after the knocking stopped and the dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out at all that much because there were 2 German Shepherds inside with me and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. I had been drinking a little, but not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking someone just simply drove up the wrong way. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone knocking loud and hard on the front door, and the dogs were going nuts. There was no way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone that had that make or model of a car, and told him about what happened the night before. He didn't know anyone and he called the police directly. The police show up and ask me a few questions and walk around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked and the police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broke down or not. There was only 1 set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up and told me that the guy who owned the car was missing, and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. I don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing, or who reported him missing. He was just missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know that much. After 1 month, I go back home, and my girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out on the town several months later, and I asked her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is the guy was found dead by suicide 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident, and he was found a couple days after he had killed himself. I asked her how he did it, and where he was found, who found him, etc., and I got nothing. I never saw her again. You all know just as much as I know, and I feel your pain. This happened to my grandfather and I in El Salvador. When I was 8 years old on a Saturday night, we were coming back from visiting relatives who lived up in the mountain from us, about an hour and a half or a 2-hour hike. During the day, it's a beautiful hiking place, but at night, it is quite scary. We ended up leaving my uncle's place later than we thought, at about 8 p.m. But we were not worried since we had done this hike hundreds of times, at all times of the day, but never after 10 p.m. According to locals, it's not safe to be out there after 10 p.m. because of weird things that they have seen and heard. Thankfully, we were prepared for nightfall. We had our own flashlight. Grandpa had a huge flashlight that was bright as a headlight on our car, and our backpack had bottles of waters and snacks. Well, halfway into our way back home, it was pretty scary. There was no moonlight, so it was really dark, and only trees all around, and a few homes here and there. We heard noises and other weird things, but since we were in the middle of mountains, we dismissed it and kept on walking. About a mile away from home, things got very weird and spooky. We couldn't even hear a cricket sound, everything just went silent. At this point, my grandfather grabbed my hand and told me to stay close. I remember getting scared and worried. I looked at my watch and it was 9:15 p.m. I told my grandpa and he said not to worry, we were almost home. I kept pointing my flashlight in front of me so I wouldn't step on something or trip. Then, about 20 feet from us was this huge tree, and it had a bow in it, which I thought was strange, and so did my grandfather. He replied with, "Well, that's interesting, a bow on a tree." Then, to our surprise, a woman wearing a gray or light blue dress, I don't really remember, was standing on the other side of the tree with her back to us. I told my grandpa, why would she be out here at this time? By herself? He said maybe she's lost or hurt. So we hurried to see if she needed help. We were about 10 feet away from her when she started walking. So Grandpa yells, "Hey, excuse me, miss, are you okay? Are you lost?" With no answer. "Do you need help?" Again, no answer. She just kept walking. After you pass the tree with the bow, about 5 to 10 feet, you go down the hill into an open space with a few trees. And there are some pretty flowers there, with a walking trail next to it. Standing on the bottom of the hill in front of the trail, Grandpa turned and said, "Come on, honey, we gotta hurry. I don't think she's okay." And when we turned back, she disappeared. We could not find her anywhere. We looked everywhere and had no luck. There was no way she could have run that fast, and the trail was pretty long with little trees scattered around, so nowhere to hide even if you wanted to. Since Grandpa had a big flashlight, we all had a pretty good view of the landscape, all around us, and we saw nothing. We kept walking and still looking, hoping to find her, but we had no luck. Once we reached the town, I looked at my watch and it was 10:15 p.m. I told Grandpa how happy I was that we had made it safe and just in time to get out of the mountains. Yet still worried about what happened to that lady. The next day, Grandpa told a neighbor of our incident with a strange woman, and he interrupted my grandfather and said, "Are you talking about the big tree right before you go down the hill?" Grandpa said, "Yes, why?" Our neighbor called his wife Susan over and began to tell us about a murder that happened in that area. On Thursday of that week, a lady was walking home around 8 p.m. or so when she came across a man who tried to rob her, and since she fought back, he stabbed her 4 times and she bled to death. She was found in the bottom of the hill the next morning. The killer was caught the next day drunk with a bloody shirt and hands with a knife in his pocket. People thought he was hurt, but when they heard the murder, they turned in him, and he did confess. My grandfather turned white, and I didn't know what to say, but we felt so bad for her. The neighbor's wife, Susan, said that we were not the only ones that have seen her. A few locals have seen her walk from the tree to the bottom of the hill, where her spirit was always back and forth. The bow on the tree was put there on her behalf. Camping in Wyoming, 2 hours from pretty much anywhere with my dad, my friend, and my dog. This dog was the calmest, albeit quite stupid, and nicest dog I've ever had. I've never heard her growl or bark at anything, no matter how much it presented a threat to us or her. She just assumed everything was friend or food. It's late at night. My dad's asleep, and my friend and I are just hanging around the campfire. Out of nowhere, the dog bolts up, barks once, and starts growling in the direction of the field next to our site. Of course we're freaking out, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, and what she's on about, when we realized there's a group of shadows on the other side of the field. We just sit there, staring at whatever it was, when we hear a conversation. No clue what language it was in. This goes on for about 10 minutes of us staring wide-eyed at the shadows. I didn't think to wake my dad for whatever reason. When the shadows just went away and my dog stops growling, it lays down and falls back asleep. That was the only time that she ever did anything like that in over a decade that we had her. It still freaks me out to this day. This past winter, I hiked on one of the high peaks of the ADKs with a buddy of mine and camped out overnight. Everything was fine the entire first day when we were there. I had a great night's sleep and woke up early to hike back to the parking area. On my way back to the trail, my friend and I noticed that someone else had been hiking as well. About a mile after walking, I stopped and saw that my full name, first and last, was drawn into the snow on the side of the footpath. I didn't do it, and neither did my friend. It was snowing a bit throughout the night, and if it was drawn the day before, the snow would have covered it up. We got a bit freaked out and decided to hustle back to our car so we could get out of there. We finally get back to the parking area, and I go to sign myself out of the registry book. When I turn the page to where I signed in, I see that someone scribbled out all my information to where you couldn't read it anymore. No one else has signed into the book besides myself for 3 days. I will not be going back there. Last year, I was with a buddy of mine and we were going to do the Hart Creek Scramble in Alberta. But due to some health conditions it was going to be strenuous to complete, and we figured we'd make it easy and just do the simple trail. Now, we're both climbers and have been to Hart Creek for rock climbing in the past and had a great time, so it wasn't a surprise to see the sporadic climbers on the mountainside as we went. Hart Creek is also pretty popular, and easy for people who just want to go for a nice nature walk and maybe have picnics. Anyway, we walked in, enjoying the day watching climbers on our way by. We saw a couple even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which means basically leapfrogging up the route. We settled in for lunch about a half hour later and left a couple of hours after that. On our way back, I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, oh, someone must have lost this. I picked it up when my buddy got my attention, and I looked further downstream. Both climbers, a young man, 29 or so, I learned later, and his partner were both lying in the creek bed, rope and harnesses still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had just seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls and having a good time. The first reaction I had was that I remembered that there was a family right behind us, a husband, a wife, and a young daughter who were playing in the creek on the way down. We ran back and stopped them and explained as quietly as we could what was ahead, and before we knew it, looky-loos had come by. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RNCP officer, so he took control of the situation. I learned later we weren't the first ones on the scene, that the authorities had been called out. It was a very quiet ride back in the town. More details. So, the couple were climbing, and they were both experienced enough, but one was still learning. They attempted to do a dual lowering maneuver, using each other's weight and feeding the rope through the belays. One of them made a mistake and lost their end of the rope, and that was it for both of them. There wasn't a lot of blood, strangely, and they looked very peaceful. I didn't get a good look at the girl. I mostly only saw the guy there. The story ran for a couple of days in the area, talking about the male as the family of the girl didn't want to disclose anything. That was not something I thought I'd see that day for sure. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. Think mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and an SAT phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in, we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in, we are in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in and the waves on the lake of the center started to swell to 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky canoes. We pulled off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp in a rush to avoid being totally thrashed by a rainstorm. we just set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning, it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp, looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. However, it was absolutely wrecked. Trash was strewn everywhere, tents collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first, we were just disgusted. What assholes would do this? Who would leave their shit out for bear food? The more we looked around, though, the weirder things seemed. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open, despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, a serious set of hiking equipment, enough for 2 to 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. Their long johns ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. It's like somebody just noped the hell out of there. We waited a couple hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else getting any distress calls. We eventually just left and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or two later we ended up the whole trip early, because it just seemed like nobody wanted to be out there anymore. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. First thought was a bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've heard bears are way too easy to scare away. I've seen bear attacks on camps before, and it was nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food, and they're generally pretty easy to scare. What still sticks with me is why all of their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and half being untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping, hiking, rafting, and biking all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. I was camping and hiking in the Okefenokee Swamp. Me and my girlfriend were far from being the only ones there, but when we woke up in the morning, we took out a canoe out into the swamp to explore. It was early. There was a thick layer of fog resting just atop the water. The whole swamp was completely still. No animals in sight at all. We paddled down the waterway for a while and saw nothing else. Not a single person. Not a bird, not anything. We didn't hear a single sound. We had just cornered a bend in the swamp, and we hear it. The loudest, guttural bellow I have ever heard in my life. I could feel it echo through my chest. A true dinosaur sound. We stopped paddling and looked around for a while, and we looked at each other creeped out. We knew it was an alligator, but we had never heard one that loud. We both looked behind the canoe behind us, and the backs and eyes of at least 20 alligators had risen. They had just surfaced out of nowhere. We slowly started to paddle forward, and we hear more bellows. They come from all around us, in front, behind, to the sides, and its sounds are emanating from the bush-covered banks. Each glance behind us, we saw more eyes appear, more scaled mounds breaking the water's surface. From the banks, huge reptiles broke the water all around us. We looked back again as we paddled faster. Easily 40 alligators behind us now. We began to see them appear in front of us. 10 to 15 huge lizards seemingly blocking our path. Then, one of the largest alligators I've ever seen surfaces right where my paddle was going down. I hit the beast on the back of the head, and the thrash he made was incredible. When this massive head hit the side of the small canoe, I thought we were going into the water. Water came into the canoe and the side dipped down. The beast disappeared below the boat and we held steady. We paddled forward as we could, right into the dotted landscape of scales and eyes. Behind us, the same guttural roar echoed through my body. As we cut through the field of eyes and backs, we started to see the path clearer. The huge monster that had almost capsized bellowed one more time. We turned as we made it past the last of the animals, and we could see the monster staring at us, watching us leave. all of the other alligators began to sink to the water's floor. The big guy stayed there watching us until he was satisfied we had gone, I guess. Then he disappeared without a sound, back into the black, murky depths of the swamp. We banked the canoe further up the waterway, got out and just sat for a while, trying to take in what we had just experienced. Alright, so here it goes. This is the story of something I experienced which I cannot explain. What I am about to describe happened over a year ago, but a close friend of mine has convinced me to finally put it out there for others to ponder. Maybe someone can help me make sense of it. The friend and my wife are the only two people that know about this up until now. I would like to make sense of it, but it's not something I can just talk about to people. Let's start with a little background before you ask, what the heck are you doing in the middle of Death Valley alone anyway? I have two professions. I'm an army officer, and I'm an adventurer. I do outdoor stuff, often as a way to recharge and refocus, because leadership does not come naturally to me as an introvert. Being in crowds is bad enough. Organizing, training, and leading crowds using every last drop of charisma is something else entirely. That's why I get away as much as possible. I seek out places of beauty and solitude which allow me to rest internally, even if it requires physical exertion to get there. If you're heavily introverted like I am, you know what I'm talking about. So, in the summer of 2015, I had just returned from Africa where I was on orders. I was drained. I had to get away. I quickly planned a trip through Death Valley. I would take my street-legal dirt bike 1,500 miles over several days through the hottest place on Earth during the hottest time of the year, just because I knew it would be the most peaceful and relaxing place I could access. Now, I did mention that I consider adventuring a profession of mine. That's because I've spent countless hours adventuring, exploring, and just escaping. I consider myself highly skilled at it, and it is also a paid occupation for me, because I document most of it through monetized channels. Which, that being said, I have seen some unusual, disturbing, and just plain cool things while I'm out there. Especially in the desert. Scavengers that will stalk you for miles hoping you would drop dead and become a meal. Caves which appear to be man-made. Hundreds of miles from anything. Traps set to immobilize vehicles or people. Old military equipment. You just see a lot of stuff when you're out there. Generally, it all makes sense though. On this adventure though, in Death Valley, however, I saw something that just didn't make sense. I had been riding all day through Death Valley. It was very hot, easily over 120 degrees, and there were very few people out there that day. In fact, I hadn't seen anybody for about half of that day since heading toward Uhebi Crater. But I did see one couple in a Mustang, just leaving Uhebi Crater when I got there. That was it. It's not surprising though, because of how hot it was and because of how our Uhebi Crater is. I headed toward Racetrack Playa, and stopped somewhere between Uhebi Crater and Racetrack Playa for the night. This is very far from anything, and only accessible by gravel road on one end and unmaintained. It's a harsh trail on the other end. There was nobody out there for obvious reasons. I unpacked my sleeping stuff and had a meal before the sun went down. I took all of my camera batteries out and hooked them up for charge for the night. I also turned my phone off and put it on the charger as well. I left all the stuff by the bike, which was just off the road. I set up my sleeping bag a distance away from the bike and the trail. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by at all, but it was just part of my tactical plan in case of a random bad guy stumbling upon my area. My bright red bike would obviously draw all the attention, and my camouflage sleeping bag would go undetected, allowing me some time and freedom to maneuver on the bad guys. I got in my sleeping bag, bringing only the camelback, my folding knife, and my red light tactical flashlight. Everything else was at the bike. It was very peaceful. It was almost silent out there. It was warm and felt really safe and was pretty easy to sleep. However, when you're on your own, you never sleep very deeply. Your mind stays alert and ready that the little things wake you. That night, There was really nothing to wake me. It was nice until about 2 a.m. That's when the event happened. I woke up to the sounds of children. Yes, children. In the middle of freaking nowhere. Here I am being woken up by children talking. It was fully enclosed in my sleeping bag, so for a moment I just stayed still trying to figure out what the heck I was hearing. It kept going, the undeniable sound of children talking to each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying. It sounded like it was 50 meters off or so. I called out, "Hello?" Still in my sleeping bag. It stopped, just for a moment, but continued. Now, I knew for sure there had to be kids there, in the middle of nowhere. I sat up, peeking out of my sleeping bag, and turned my flashlight on. I scanned the direction of the noises, which was the opposite direction of the trail and my bike. There they were. 2 kids, 50 to 75 meters out or so, opposite direction of the trail in the middle of nowhere. They were walking, kind of wandering, looking lost and sounding lost. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but it had a tone of discussion, like they were deliberating to figure out what to do or where to go. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello?" They stopped. They looked in my direction, but they were looking past me. In my direction, but not at me. Like they heard me, but I wasn't even there. I was illuminating them in a very bright flashlight. They should have been covering their faces, but they were just scanning, like they were looking for me and just didn't see me. They turned back, kept walking, and I just watched them, not sure what to do. Their noises and their images faded into the distance. I just sat there. I didn't know what to think or what to do. It was just so bizarre. After a while, I laid back down and just relaxed until it started raining at about 5:30 a.m. That's when I packed up in the darkness and continued with my adventuring into the morning. So that's what I saw. I saw children in Death Valley, over 100 miles from freaking anything, just walking, talking, and wandering, and then vanishing. Oddly enough, it didn't freak me out at the moment. I was more confused than anything. That's why I couldn't make a decision on what to do in that moment. Now, looking back, it's freaky. I started my career working in sawmills back in 2007. I was hired for a portable sawmill in southwest Washington state. This mill was located quite literally in the middle of the forest. It was constructed in the early 70s, and even in the short 30 years of its life, it seemed to have a decent amount of history inside of it. I worked the weekend graveyard shift, 2:30 to 4:30, the following day on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. I was a trim drop operator. I had a partner who I worked with, and we were the only two in the area. His name is Pete. We would take turns rotating through the night. One of us would run the drop, where you drop the bad boards, chunks of garbage, and just about anything else that can't be turned into quality lumber. The boards that would be left to be processed would enter a lugged, chain system and then be pulled through a scanner, and then a trim box that would cut the lumber to length and then take them to the next area, which was the sorter. The other of us would sit at the operator's console about 20 feet away and watch monitors that displayed the various parts of the machine and process flow. We rotate every few thousand boards to keep from being fatigued. One night, I was running the drop, and Pete was kicked back at the console station, reading away at the newspaper. Everything was going just as normal as ever, when I glanced over and noticed him peering up at the monitor for the outfeed with a puzzled look on his face. He jumped up and went walking down to the trimmer saw box and looked around it. He then walked back looking quite concerned, sat down and shrugged and started reading again. This happened a second time, but by now, it had my attention. I threw up the skids to stop the flow of lumber and walked over to him and asked him what was up. There was a guy standing at the outfeed. I went down there to see what the hell was going on, and when I got over there he was gone, he said, with a confused look on his face. This didn't make sense, because this was an area that wasn't accessible unless you stop the machine and activate a catwalk that unfolds from the outfeed of the sawbox to allow access to a small platform on the opposite side of the machine. I asked him to point out where this guy was hanging out. Pete pointed to the platform, slightly frustrated. I shook my head at him and laughed before running back to the drop to continue running lumber. Pete stayed fixed on the monitors now, newspaper folded up and thrown to the side. Not but 5 minutes later go by before he jumps up and runs around the sawmill. This is the time that I threw the skids up and followed him. By the time I got there was nothing. He pointed across the lumber table, which was 30 feet wide, to the platform across the machine and yells, "Who's over there? We weren't allowed to be over here, god damn it!" Both of us waited to see the man he had seen on the monitor, but once again, there was nothing. After a minute or so of looking on, we decided to move back to our stations. I walked to the console station, glancing at the monitor, seeing nothing, and Pete followed shortly behind. By the time I made it to the drop to start again, Pete howled. I snapped around and saw him stabbing the monitor with his finger, yelling for me to come back. I ran over and looked at the monitor. Sure enough, there was a guy. He was standing on the small platform Pete pointed out. The monitor was small, grainy and black and white, but we were able to work out that this guy is wearing a tin hard hat, a very dirty and worn button-up long sleeve, with the sleeves either rolled up or ripped off, and everything was dirty, with these very thick denim jeans of a dark color. He was just standing there, with his elbows on the handrail looking at the lumber from the sawbox. "Wait here," Pete yelled as he stealthily snuck down to the outfeed once again. As he closed in on the outfeed area to catch this guy red-handed for being in the area you can't be or shouldn't access while in operation, I looked back and forth at Pete and the monitor about the time Pete made it to the sawbox. The man on the corner looked up into the camera and literally just faded away. I completely lost my shit. I felt the cold chill run down my back, accompanied by all the hairs on my arms standing up. I sprinted as quickly as I could to Pete, exclaiming, "That ain't a guy. It wasn't a fucking guy." Pete just stood there dumbfounded, both of us now looking at the platform with our own eyes. "What should we do?" I asked, quite dumbfounded and disturbed now. Pete crossed his arms and thought, before deciding we should call our foreman down to tell him this story. We walked back to the operator station, and Pete grabbed the mic on the radio and called for the foreman. We ran up until he arrived, both of us ready to bolt for the sawbox in case we saw the entity again. The foreman showed up after about 5 minutes, and we stopped running and explained what had happened. The foreman didn't look impressed, but he was smiling. He explained that we had just seen one of our old-timers. Back in the late 70s, we had a man who worked here, who ran the chip bin station, and one day, arrogance got the best of him. Long story short, he got buried in a chip pile and was crushed and suffocated before he could dig himself out. The foreman said he was one of the only people to ever work here and wear a tin hard hat, as homage to his previous career as a logger in the woods. Other operators have had occurrences where they've witnessed this entity wandering around different machines, seeming just to watch the flow of lumber.